Hi, welcome to Ella Law Tutorials. Please like, share, and subscribe. Today we are going to cover Chapter 1, Criminal Law. Before a person can be convicted of any crime, the following conditions must be met. The first question to ask when determining a person's criminal liability is whether the conduct that is the basis of the charge is recognized as a crime under our law. A court may not convict and punish a person solely because it believes his behavior is immoral or dangerous to society, or because the person deserves to be punished. On the contrary, it must be beyond doubt that X's alleged type of behavior is a crime under the law. The principle of legality refers to this obvious principle. A court cannot find someone guilty and sentence him to punishment merely because it believes his behavior to be immoral, dangerous to society, or simply because the person deserves to be punished. Contrarily, it must be undeniable that X's alleged type of behavior is a crime that is punishable by law. The principle of legality is a very simple principle. Although this requirement must be considered, it is never regarded as an element of a crime in the sense that the accused must comply with it through his actions and subjective characteristics. This consideration is highlighted by the fact that in most criminal cases, the accused is charged with a crime that is so well known, for example assault, theft, culpable homicide, that the court will not waste its time investigating whether such a crime exists in our law. Only in very exceptional cases does the court need to study a statute, for example, to determine whether what the accused is charged with truly constitutes a crime. So, what determines whether a crime is a crime? There are 4 elements of a crime to consider, and if they are determined, then a crime is punishable. Let's start with the first element, which is an act or conduct. Assuming that the behavior is considered illegal by the law, the first step in determining whether X is subject to criminal prosecution is to determine whether X engaged in any behavior. The term conduct refers to a deed or omission. This requirement of liability is frequently referred to as the requirement of an act because the punishment for omissions is more the exception than the rule. The definition of act as it is used in criminal law does not exactly match the common usage of the word. More specifically, it should not be equated with a physical movement or contraction of a muscle. Instead, it should be viewed as a technical term that, under certain conditions, can refer to a failure to act. Only voluntary conduct can result in liability for criminal law purposes. If X is able to control his bodily or muscular movements with his will or intellect, then the behavior is voluntary. Because of this, the law does not deem the physical actions of, for instance, a somnambulist, sleepwalker, to constitute an act. Only if the law imposed a duty on X to act positively and X failed to do so can an omission, for example a failure by X to act positively, result in liability. After determining whether or not an act exists, the second component is the definitional elements of the crime. The general requirement for criminal liability is that X's conduct must adhere to the definitional elements of the crime at hand. What exactly is meant by the definitional elements of the crime? It is a concise definition of the type of conduct that must occur and the circumstances under which that conduct must occur in order to constitute an offense. We can see how one type of crime differs from another by examining these definitional elements. For example, the definition of robbery is the violent removal and appropriation of movable corporeal property belonging to another. Every specific offense has requirements that other offenses do not. The requirement for liability with which we are concerned here is simply that X's conduct must comply with or correspond to the definitional elements. To put it another way, it must be conduct that satisfies the definitional elements or by which these definitional elements are realized. Unlawfulness is the third step to determine. The mere compliance with the definitional elements does not imply that the act is also unlawful in the sense that the term is used in criminal law. If a father gives his misbehaving child a moderate hiding in order to discipline him, or a police officer catches a criminal on the run by knocking him to the ground in a tackle, their respective acts are not unlawful, and they are thus not guilty of assault, despite the fact that these acts satisfy the definitional elements of the crime of assault. Unlawful obviously means contrary to the law, but law in this context refers to the totality of the rules of law, which includes rules that, in certain circumstances, allow a person to commit an act that is contrary to the letter of the legal prohibition or norm. In practice, there are several well-known cases in which the law tolerates an act that violates the letter of the definitional elements. These are referred to as justification grounds. Private defense, including self-defense, necessity, consent, right of chastisement, and judicial capacity, are well-known grounds of justification. In the preceding examples, the act of the father who gives his son a hiding is justified by the legal ground known as right of chastisement, whereas the act of the policeman is justified by the legal ground known as official capacity. The final factor to consider is culpability. The final and most important requirement is that X's actions have been culpable. The culpability requirement means that there must be grounds for X to be held personally responsible for his actions. The emphasis shifts from the act to the actor, X, and his personal abilities and knowledge, or lack thereof. Two questions or sub-requirements make up the culpability requirement. The first of these sub-requirements is criminal capacity, often shortened to capacity. This means that X must have had certain mental abilities at the time the act was committed. A person cannot be held legally responsible for his actions unless he possesses these mental abilities. X must have the following mental abilities. Number 1, the ability to recognize the wrongfulness of his actions, for example, to distinguish between right and wrong. And number 2, the ability to act in accordance with such recognition. Mentally ill, insane, people and young children are two examples of people who lack criminal capacity. The second sub-requirement, or leg of the culpability requirement, is that X's act be intentional or negligent. The majority of offenses require intent, but there are some that only require negligence. In summary, the four general requirements for committing a crime are 1. Conduct that is unlawful, 2. Culpable, and 3. Complies to the definitional elements of the crime, and 4. Unlawfulness. It is crucial to keep in mind that there is a specific order in which the four requirements for, or elements of, liability listed above must be investigated, namely the order in which the requirements were listed above. If it turns out that there was no voluntary conduct on the part of X, as was initially suspected, the case will be dismissed and X will not be found guilty of the alleged crime. The investigation of whether additional requirements, such as unlawfulness and culpability, have been met is then not necessary. Only when it is obvious that the conduct requirement has been met is it necessary to look into whether the conduct complied with the definitional elements. Again, it is only necessary to investigate whether the conduct has met the definitional requirements if it is obvious that it has, and only if the latter requirement has been met is it necessary to investigate whether X's act was also culpable. Therefore, an investigation into a later requirement assumes the existence of the earlier requirements, in terms of the order we just mentioned. The fundamental rule governing the requirements order may be likened to the parable of the boy whose kite became stuck on the very top of a very high branch of a tree. The kite had become stuck on a branch, and the boy was hopelessly too short to reach up and grab it. He first moved a table into position directly beneath the branch in order to reach the kite. He then set a chair on the table. Thirdly, brandishing a long stick, he ascended the chair. Fourthly, he poked the kite with the stick while reaching out to it, which allowed him to successfully free the kite from the branch. Similar steps are taken in the criminal liability investigation. It's similar to getting the kite to say that someone committed a crime to come to that conclusion. The first or bottom agent in the table stands for an acts requirement. The chair, second agent, stands in for the demand that the definitional elements be adhered to. The stick, fourth agent, represents the culpability requirement, while the boy, third agent, symbolizes the unlawfulness requirement. In order to successfully reach the kite with the stick, all four of the necessary objects, or agents, must be present. It is useless to wave the fourth agent, the stick, around in an attempt to free the kite if the first agent, the table, cannot be located or does not exist. If we apply this metaphor to the laws governing criminal liability, it follows that it would be pointless to ask X whether he intended to commit an offense, the fourth requirement, if it turned out that he hadn't even committed a crime, the first requirement. As a result, the investigation must always begin at the bottom and work its way up, never the other way around. Each agent, table, chair, boy, and stick, rests on the one or more agents below it, with the exception of the table, which is naturally at the bottom. It becomes unnecessary to inquire about the existence of any potential additional requirements or elements, that is, agents that are above them, once it becomes clear that any one of the four requirements is missing, that is, has not been complied with. As a result, there is no criminal liability, the kite cannot be retrieved. This activity, which is also included in the study guide, is crucial because it aids in the application of the ideas and components we have covered. Okay, are you prepared? Let's say X is accused of assaulting Y. According to the evidence used by the prosecution to support the charge, one night as X was sleeping, he trampled upon Y, who was at the time dozing off on the floor. Has X assaulted anyone? Clearly, no is the correct response for the following reasons. X's action was not voluntary because he was sleepwalking, in other words, he was unable to control his bodily movements with his will or intellect. He is not guilty of assault because there was no act. Or, to use the metaphor in the example above, there was no table for the boy to use, so any attempt by him to retrieve his kite would be futile even with the help of a chair and a stick. It is not necessary to determine, for instance, whether X's action was unlawful or whether he acted with malice, culpability. Saying that X is exempt from liability because he didn't intend to assault the victim is unsatisfactory from a systematic standpoint and shows poor legal reasoning. Such a claim assumes that X voluntarily committed the act, which is clearly untrue. Question 2. What are the four elements of criminal liability? 1. Conduct. 2. That complies with the definitional elements of the crime. 3. And that is unlawful. 4. And culpable. Interesting, right? We have reached Chapter 1 of Criminal Law. Please, subscribe.